Okay, welcome everyone. I am Nancy Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Presbyterian Historical Society, and I'm very glad you could join us today for PHS Live. We're going to look at the Presbyterian mission in Persia, including the genesis of a recently published book on the life of missionary John Haskell Shedd. There are several housekeeping details that I want to go over before we start. The session is being recorded, and the recording will be available in the next week or so from the PHS Live section of the Presbyterian Historical Society website. The session will last 1 hour, and we are going to leave at least 10 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. And you can type in those questions at any time in the Q&A feature of Zoom, which should be, if you're on a full-size monitor, down toward the bottom of your screen. And my colleague, PHS Director of Communications, Kristen Gatos, is going to be moderating that Q&A at the end. I'm very pleased to be joined today by three individuals who have played a major role in bringing the biography of John Haskell Shedd to light and to print. Scholar Hooman Estelami and two siblings who are great-grandchildren of John Haskell Shedd, Celia Lottridge and Jonathan Shedd Barker. So I want to do some quick introductions. Dr. Hooman Estelami is a professor of marketing at Fordham University and the author of the 2021 book, The Americans of Urmia, Iran's First Americans and Their Mission to the Assyrian Christians. He also co-authored a 2023 article in the Journal of Presbyterian History about Howard Baskerville, and he penned the introduction to the life of John Haskell Shedd. So Dr. Estelami will be setting the scene for us with a PowerPoint presentation outlining the history of 19th century mission work in Persia, focusing particularly on the Urmia region, and connecting John Haskell Shedd to the author of the biography, his son and fellow missionary, William Ambrose Shedd. And we are also joined by two speakers today, John Haskell Shedd's great-grandchildren. So I want to welcome Dr. Jonathan Shedd Barker, who's author of the preface to the book, and he is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. And also Celia Barker Lottridge, a storyteller, children's writer, and librarian who has lived for many years in Canada. So Hooman, I will turn things over to you to get us started.
Thank you very much. First thing first, I want to thank the Presbyterian Historical Society for hosting this session, but also for years of supporting the research that facilitated the production of this book, and actually also putting me in touch with the Shedd descendants, with whom I've had the honor of working on this manuscript for about 3.5, 4 years now. So what I'm going to do is I will share my screen, and we'll have I guess a PowerPoint document to look at. And so this is actually the cover of the book that was just recently published by Mazda Publishers. The book itself is actually written by William Ambrose Shedd, who was the son of John Haskell Shedd, a biography, if you will, of his father. And the choice of the cover design, a smart choice, if you will, by the publisher, is quite informative because, of course, you see the picture of John Haskell Shedd, in the backdrop, you see the map where he was located. So what I'm going to do is to try and help us understand who he was, why he was significant, and why the whole conversation is important. What I want to do is to first talk about sort of the geography of where he served and where other American missionaries were serving. So this is a map of Persia. This is a modern map of Iran, which is pretty much the same boundaries, if you will, as what they were dealing with at that time. And the location where all of the early missionary work, the American early missionary work, was taking place is what you see in the top left-hand corner, which is the city of Urmia. Now, this is significant because if you think of missionary entry into any country, usually it's the locations that are chosen are central locations, capitals, big population centers, and Oromia is nothing like that. So the Americans chose this location for specific reasons, which I'll get into in a few minutes. So that's one thing that's significant. The other thing that's significant is that the location itself is a relatively high-risk location in terms of the access or the issues that might, for example, spill over from the Ottoman Empire, or the tensions that would exist between the Russians and the Ottomans, and so on and so forth. So it was a very vulnerable area, as well as other issues about Kurdish independence and things of that type. And so what we'll do is we'll actually zoom in on kind of a more an older map, if you will. One thing I should mention is the name Urumia is spelled in many, many different ways. So as we go through the PowerPoints, if you see the spelling, changing, especially when we look at the older maps, that's not unusual. But you can actually see the city of Urmia sort of in this in the sort of center of this map somewhat. To the east is a lake called Lake Urmia, and then to the west is really the boundaries between the Ottoman Empire back then and Persia. So the mountain ranges that you see here are what we're dealing with. And so to kind of give us a feel for what it was to live there, and what was John Haskell's experience, William Shedd's experience, what was the American experience? And this is critical, because if you look at the history of the relationships between the United States and Persia and ask yourself, where did this relationship begin from the point of view of people residing in the other countries, specifically Americans residing in Persia or modern-day Iran, the answer is Urumia. They did not live in Tehran or Shiraz or anywhere like that. And so this map, in fact, is an American-produced map from the 1850s. So what we'll do is we'll take a look at what their life was about. So the city at the time that the American missionaries arrived in 1835 had 25,000 people, and there was a large proportion that was Jewish. And then there was the Assyrians and the Armenians. The Americans chose to use the word Nestorian to describe the followers of Nestorius. Modern day terminology more kind of gravitates towards the use of the word Assyrian. So we're not going to get into the details of that, but in total, there was a large Assyrian population, and it was important because that was the target population that the American missionaries intended to serve. There was 40,000 in that area and another 110,000 across the Ottoman border, which is one of the reasons why this location was chosen, because it gave them access to the Syrian Christian population in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, and it gave them access to the population of Assyrians in Persia, which were predominantly in Urumia. The name of the city, in case you're interested, linguistically goes back to this term, town of water, if you will. And that's because there's a lot of water. And so if you take a look at this, is now just to clarify, most of the images that I'm about to share with you are from the Presbyterian Historical Society's archives. Many are actually from material that the Shedd family, through Jonathan, Celia, and others, have over the years donated to the Presbyterian Historical Society. They are truly unique because they give you a real life feel for what it felt back then to live there. This one is we're starting towards the eastern end of the map we were just looking at. This is the lake itself. The lake has shrunk significantly since then because of the evaporation of the water. And it actually had some use, but not a lot, up until the second half of the 19th century. So if you wanted to use it for transporting materials, until steam-powered boats became commercialized, you were at the mercy of the winds, literally. So it wasn't really useful from that perspective, but it had other uses. So, it was great for swimming, because in a lake where it's just very salty, everybody floats and everybody thinks they're a great swimmer. And so the picture you're looking at here is actually one of the missionaries believing, and it seems to be that he's doing quite well, swimming. Another image is, again, this one, again, it's a missionary group, missionary family, and they are actually, using the lake for boating and outing, if you will. So that's the lake itself. But in reality, it wasn't really helpful for transport. It was more of a strategic barrier, if you will, when it came to movement of people and goods. In this city itself, in fact, to enter the city, you had to go through a gate, in fact, multiple gates. This was the main gate. Again, these are pictures from the Shedd family archives. And so that's the gate you had to go through. And the city kind of looked like what you see here, like any other city in Persia or in the Ottoman Empire, with its own streets and with its own infrastructure, if you will. And it had its streets, it had its people. This picture, in case you're interested, is taken by Margaret Shedd, this particular one in 1908. But again, it shows a typical street and religious processions that are taking place at that point in time. Typical, markets, as you would see even today in many of the cities in that region, and people living their daily lives. So nothing unusual as far as the interior of the city itself. When you move to the exterior, what is called the Urmia field, if you will, the larger field from a missionary perspective, you are now working with different population groups. So the population group, the Syrian Christian population group that they were interested in, has also been extensively photographed. The PHS archives have an immense volume, if you will, of photographs of the Assyrian population at that point in time. What you see on the right-hand side is a family of a medical doctor, an Assyrian medical doctor in the city of Urmia. And what you see on the left-hand side is another family, this particular family being more in the mountainous regions outside the city, in fact, more towards the west, towards the Kurdish mountains. And so different, as you can see, different ways of dressing, different ways of living. But again, a population that's been extensively documented through the missionary photography that's been done, and a large portion of which actually done through the Shedd family and Louise Wilbur Shedd, who was the second wife of William Shedd. And so these are, now if you go further west, this is what you would see, basically agricultural type settings where there's agricultural water reserves. And that itself was a contributor to a large extent to deaths, if you will, because of medical issues that arise because of malaria, because of cholera, those kinds of diseases were prominent, unfortunately, because of these water pools that you see for agricultural purposes. But it is, even today, a highly productive agricultural environment. And so it was the same back then as well. Now, if you go further west, closer to the Turkish border, the angle of incline begins to increase. And as a result, getting from one location to another can become a challenge. And this is one of the main reasons that, in fact, we find the population of Assyrians being concentrated in this particular region. Just because of safety that it creates in that environment. What I want to do is very quickly provide so this was the sort of the topography, if you will, of the environment in which John Haskell Shedd operated. He himself was someone who loved to travel, who loved to be, out in the outdoors and go on these trips to understand what the Assyrians in these mountains were all about and speak with them and do his missionary work. Um, the bigger picture in terms of timeline is what we see here. So if you look at the timeline of American missionary work, and specifically as to how it relates to missionary work in Persia, the work itself, in the broader sense, started in the early part of the 19th century with the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which was a combination of Congregationalists, Presbyterians, and the Dutch Reformed. And the three kind of work together because they share Reformed Calvinistic principles. So they worked together. They launched what's called a mission. They, again, as you notice, they use the term Nestorian, mission to the Nestorians. The first missionary arrived in Urmia in 1835. They eventually renamed it in 1870 to Mission to Persia, and at the end of the year handed that mission field to the Presbyterian Board. And from there on, pretty much most of missionary work in Persia was Presbyterian. And then a whole bunch of things, good things, happened in the sense that there was a medical college and a university, if you will, college facility set up in Urmia, an evangelical church established. And then towards the end of sort of the lifespan of this mission, which ended in 1934 for a range of reasons, the events of World War I came about, and the mission, which at that time was a Presbyterian missionary organization, became highly influential in protecting the Assyrian population. Now, as far as the timing and where John Haskell Shedd fits in, this is sort of the picture that we have, which is that he was born in 1833. He went to Persia with his wife, Sarah, in 1859. And then for many years, he was there, involved in the formation of the Assyrian Evangelical Church, which is basically a Presbyterian entity. And then between 1870 and 1878, he was back in the United States working with freed slaves, and then returned in 1879 and was instrumental in the establishment of the what was called Urmia College, as well as the establishment of formal diplomatic relations between the United States and Persia, primarily because the American missionaries and the population there was so vulnerable. There was an urgent need to have direct diplomatic relations between the two nations. He died in 1895, and his son, William Ambrose Shedd, continued the work until World War I, and he actually passed away during World War I, helping the Assyrian population, the refugee population that had been kind of in that area as a result of World War I. So the reason, I'm going to just elaborate a little bit more, the reason why this particular biography is significant is that when you look at American mission work in Persia, especially the early years, and when you look at what has been documented, who has a biography and who doesn't, the answer is, well, these are the main ones. If you've ever studied or had an interest, Justin Perkins was the first American to reside in Persia, and he launched this mission. Grant focused on medical work, especially in the mountains. Stoddard established the Assyrian languages, sort of grammatical principles. Fidelia Fisk focused on female education. And then you have a 50-year gap if you look at the age in terms of the birth dates. So then we jump to Joseph Cochran, who established a medical school, and William Shedd, in fact, John Haskell's son, who, again, as I mentioned, was influential in many ways, including the Syrian refugee relief work that was needed. And so John Shedd was sort of lost in the middle, and this is one of the reasons why it's important. So when he came on board, this is sort of looking at the mission work that was done. When he came on board, a lot of things actually began to happen, including what is called a college compound, which is actually still in some form there, and industrial education. And so the first thing was establishment or purchase of a very large piece of land, which eventually transformed into what was called Kala by the locals because it looked like a fortress, and it actually physically, again, relying on the archival photographs, it looked like a fortress with viewing sort of towers and things like that. And it housed the first medical school in all of Iran. It was the first sort of modern medical college, if you will. These are the photographs, the one at the top from the 1880s, the one at the bottom from the 1910s, and the one at the right from the 1920s. And you can actually see these trees that they had planted back in late 1880s began, they grew. What is interesting is that they're still there. So if you look at a satellite image of Urmia University, today's Urmia University, which is basically the same campus, that campus is the same campus of what John Shedd had established. Those trees are still there. Those avenues that you see here are still visible from the sky, as well as the medical school, the building for the medical school, which is also still there. Another contribution of John Shedd was the establishment of the Assyrian, or help in the establishment of the Assyrian Evangelical Church. So most of his work was in between 1859 and 1870, which is a growth age. He left to live in the US for a while, and then by the time he returned and at the end of his life, by 1895, it had a membership of around 2,800, and many congregations relying primarily on native preachers. The significance of this from a Presbyterian perspective is that the structure and the sort of the theological foundation of it are very much Presbyterian based. So the structure with multiple synods, voting processes, and different boards, very much following the Presbyterian model. I'm going to wrap up, and then if you don't mind, Nancy, I'll pass it back to you. Just the history of how this manuscript came about. What we know, based on what's in the manuscript, is that William Shedd finished the first 19 of the 21 chapters by 1912. Then the world around him began falling apart with Ottoman incursion into Northwestern Persia, and then eventually World War I. He unfortunately died during World War I. And so the manuscript ended up somehow making it out of Urmia. Finally, his third wife, Mary Louise Shedd, extracted parts of that manuscript because we see excerpts of it in The Measure of a Man, which is a biography of William Shedd. And then eventually, again, based on what we know, Ephraim Shedd, William Shedd's brother, added the last, or completed the last two chapters in the 1930s. But then again, you have the shutting down of the Presbyterian mission in Urmia in World War II, and as a result, nothing really happened. And it's really through William Shedd's two youngest daughters, Louise and Bertha, that this kind of got passed down. And so Celia, Jonathan, as well as Jonathan's wife, Nancy Barker, and Lucy Hennigan, their sister, basically discovered this. And this is during the darkest and coldest moments during COVID that this was discovered. And eventually putting everything together with photographs taken by Louise Wilbur, everything all came together, and that's where the book is. And so that's sort of the big picture of where things are. And yeah, so Nancy, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Hooman. I went to ask Celia and Jonathan if they would share just a little bit more about how and kind of why and when the manuscript was discovered. And it's one thing to kind of discover a handwritten history that you didn't know for sure existed to having it become a published book. So I think we would all like to hear a little bit more about how this fit into the way you had been already paying attention to the history of your family, and then how this particular piece of it now is published for folks to read and learn much more about John Haskell Shedd.
So who's going to speak first here? I'll say something. We had in a room where our mother lived now in Tennessee after our father died, many papers. And one of the surprising things for me is that given the crisis that the mission went through, how they brought home so many papers, but they did it. And I think it might have happened over a period of time. And these were scattered among different parts of the family to some degree, but many of them came to our mother, and many more came to her sister Bertha. And well, as my mother aged, she became very interested in some of these papers, especially the ones about her mother, who had died when she was, what, 8 years old or so. And yeah, and she hadn't known her mother that well, of course, and then had been brought to the US, and then her father had died soon thereafter. So she had grown up with relatives during a time of crisis where the communications with the mission was difficult. From these documents, she learned a lot about her mother and about how her mother dealt with her. And she herself then read many letters, and some of our family, especially my wife Nancy, typed them up, and my mother helped annotate them. So we had these documents, and we wanted, and this was also our mother's wish, that they go into an archive where they could be available and used by other people. And the Presbyterian archive seemed to be the best one. So even when was it, 2019, we shipped a couple of good cartons full of these books to Nancy Taylor in the archives. And that kind of stood there for a little while like that, because we live in Toronto, the papers were in Tennessee. But somehow, as we were approaching COVID, it seemed more important to do something with them, and we had some time. And that's when we started looking a little more. And I think Celia might pick up there.
Yes. Well, it was daunting, let's say, because there were so many different kinds of documents. There were many letters, as Jonathan said, and then different papers that somehow come to us. How they all came to us, I do not know. But anyway, but I think because of my mother wanting to know more about her mother and about sort of her to connect again with her childhood, which had been totally severed by war. She and her sister left a few months after their mother died, and that was it. They were gone. They were not there, and they were not with people who knew the mission or knew the people that they knew. They knew her mother, but they didn't know any of the other people. So it was so she was first interested in knowing about her mother, but then we realized we had all these other different kinds of papers. And but I think because it was my mother being interested in her parents, I think this is maybe just me, but we sort of overlooked some of the things that dealt with an early and sort of before my mother was born time, the people, and my grandfather's first marriage and all of that. And we sort of knew that we had this, that there was a book that had been written, but we knew it hadn't been published. And in the meantime, our mother would occasionally do this thing of saying, well, why don't you take these home, dear? And I was interested in family stories, and I was writing books for children of different ages, and anyway, and so she saw me as being interested in a certain way. Anyway, as it happened, and I can't even remember the timing of this. One day, somebody said to me, and it might have been Jonathan, maybe you have something about. I know there's this book that William Shedd wrote, and you should just look in those boxes you have in the basement. And I did, and lo and behold, there was the manuscript of, it was a bound manuscript of this biography that William Shedd had written about his father. And it had just been sitting there because I personally was focusing on the William Shedd era. And this is a perfect question for researchers. Nobody had asked. And nobody said to me, maybe in your basement you have something. Anyway, so when I looked, there it was. And so that's how this manuscript was discovered, safely sitting in a box in my basement in Toronto. And the rest is the story of this book that Jonathan then, we all read it, but Jonathan did the big job of editing it and writing an introduction. But it was we all were involved in caring about it, but I give Jonathan give him the byline for having done that work. But it was, I think I would say to anybody who has family papers, you probably don't know what you have. And unless you look, you won't know. You have to look at each thing, and that's a terrible lot of work. But between the fact that my mother didn't throw things away, the fact that we realized we should sort stuff out and send it to the archives, and the fact that we're willing to let things sit in our basement and then we'll look at them eventually, it all came together. So that's my part of the story of this book.
Just,
And
I,
Celia,
what-
sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
I just want to add two people and events. I mean, in that earlier phase when we were going through some of the documents, our cousin Curtis, who's the son of our mother's sister Bertha, that Hooman mentioned, got very interested in John Haskell Shedd's trips. When he first went to Persia, you have to think of this man. He was 21 years old. He was newly married. He lived in a country that was about to go to civil war, and he knew this was a crisis in the United States at the time. And his family had been very active in the anti-slavery movement and remained active while he was away. But he chose, and it had to do with his religious faith and his wife, Sarah Jane, to go to Persia. And he didn't choose Persia, that was chosen for him. But he wanted to serve people. He probably mainly wanted to bring Christianity to people who were not Christian, but he knew the Nestorians were the main people he would deal with. But when he got there, he spent a lot of time going west up into those very steep mountains. And there's some wonderful accounts of the trips he took, and he made many notes. He was very, as Hooman has said, meticulous note taker. And he was faithful to that task. And Curtis was especially interested in that because it was an early look at a way of life that, as we'll learn, has largely disappeared, been destroyed by fighting of various kinds. So he worked with my mother on some of this, so he gets a lot of credit for that interest in it. And after he died, his daughter Carolyn did one amazing thing. Hooman got interested in this. He can tell you that story, and was trying to get in touch with this Shedd family. And for some reason he chose, or it turned out he could find Carolyn. And Carolyn got in touch with Celia and me. And then Hooman himself has been a source of energy and consistency in our work that we can't you can't overstate it. It's been very important. And it kept us, and I think actually when I think about the COVID time, it gave us a really good project to do in this time when we couldn't see other people so well. So that was great. So those people deserve much credit. And I want to say one other thing because I just discovered it, or heard about it recently. Because of this seminar, I got back in touch with Carolyn, who communicated with other cousins, that is offspring from Bertha, that we're not in very close touch with. And I think one who may be listening here, Polly Campbell, I think she had a volume, an identical volume to the one we had. And I know I saw a question that I think Nancy Taylor came up with it. Well, why wasn't this published in the 1930s? Well, something was done. At least 2 bound volumes were created out of this book, and who knows how many more are hidden in other people's basements someplace. But the difference is, to making it a book is first some important annotation, much of which Hooman contributed, because it mentions all kinds of names and places, and it's good to be able to identify them more clearly. And secondly, it has the photographs that Will Shedd's wife, third wife, our grandmother, took, and they are unusual pictures, and they came out very well in this book. It's good to have it. Yeah.
And I think just building on Jonathan's point, the timing of things was quite amazing, because the material that you had donated to the Presbyterian Historical Society was, I believe, passed on to the PHS in May of 2019. But these are 4 massive boxes, and there are many more that had been donated years earlier. For me personally, it was truly transformational. I remember the day I started. There were 2 days actually, and the second day when I started seeing the photographs, like you mentioned, Jonathan, that Louise Wilbur Shedd had taken, they truly just take you to a completely different time and place, and you're there. It's one thing to read about these places and people. It's another thing to literally be transported into their world through those photographs. So, she did an amazing job. I don't think without those photographs, many of the conversations we have around missionary work would be the same. And I think those photographs are still, not sufficiently discovered by researchers. I think there's more that you have passed on to the PHS just recently that I was looking at. There are new images that no one has ever seen before. But it's sort of related to that. I guess maybe if you don't mind, I want to ask Celia, in terms of your own work. I mean, you've done a preservation of family history through your own novel based on your aunt, Susan, in her work, humanitarian work, if you will, right after the passing of her father in World War I. Can you speak to that a little bit? And because that also is similar in spirit.
Yeah, well, this is the book. It's, I don't know if you can see it. It's called Home is Beyond the Mountains. And it has on the cover some of these photographs, actually. Well, I've written I've written a number of books for children, and two novels that are based on my father's family history in Canada, actually, and then this one, which is based on my mother's, which to me, stories, are everywhere. And if you write if you take family stories and put them into a context and that make them make sense to other people, then you're sharing some history in a way that is about people, not just historical events. And I mean, Susan, my aunt Susan, who is the eldest of William Shedd's 2 older daughters, she was very, very close to her father. she was the oldest when I mean, she was the oldest and the one that I think he felt he could really write to and share thoughts with. And she went to the US to go to high school, and she lived with one of her father's brothers, and then went to Vassar, and they exchanged letters consistently. And the few times that he came to America to do administrative work and information distribution about the mission, he always had visits with Susan, and I think they were close in their minds. They communicated well, and so when she said to my mother one time that she was the last person to see him when he returned to Persia, after bringing his younger children after their mother died. That would be our mother and Bertha. Susan was the last person he saw. He stopped, got off the train at where she could meet him, and she said goodbye. And she said, I knew he had to go, and I knew I would never see him again, because he was going into such a dangerous situation of war. And well, how can that not register with you if you are interested in families and what happens to them? And then I won't tell the whole story of the story, but how she ended up. What she wanted to do was go to Persia. The war in that area had sort of, it was going on more in other places, but there had been all these refugees who had to leave. And what she did was get a job with the Near East Relief, which was a huge organization, a multinational organization that tried to deal with the millions of people who had been displaced by this war. And she got a job so that she could go to Persia. She wanted to work with the people that she'd grown up with. And one of her big power things was she could speak Syriac. Very hard to find a person to send to Persia who could actually speak Syriac. So she was sent, and so then I found out more about, well, fortunately she wrote about it, and she tried to help to raise money. She ended up running a orphanage for children who had been, girls who had been made orphan, girls and boys, that was in Hamadan. It was in the city of Hamadan in Persia, but these children all came from the area where she had grown up. And so her mission was to get them home, because the war was over, and she knew that their parents may be dead, but there would be somebody who would welcome them, because family is bigger than just your mother and your father. And so that is what she actually did. But I decided to write the novel, not focusing on her, but on some children who were displaced by the war, and the children followed the same fleeing path that my grandfather followed, and I because I knew something about that, I could write about these children fleeing through the mountains. So I kind of shadowed, I guess, William Shedd, and so it was real, how people died on that way. And then these children in my book, these fictional children, got to this very large refugee camp in where is it? In
Iraq, in Iraq.
Yeah, in Iraq. And William Shedd's third wife visited there, and she wrote some letters about it. So I had heard what she said about this refugee camp. So that was very useful. So you see the family all kind of fed into it, because I had what Susan wrote, I had what this third wife wrote, I had, of course, history, and then oral history. And fortunately, Susan had talked to my mother about how she ran this orphanage, which was it was, I would say, it was unique how she ran the orphanage, because she wanted the children to be able to go back to life. You know, she wanted them to have skills and be able to go back to their villages, but be you know, grown up. They were by that time they would be young adults. So fortunately, she had talked to mother, and then she wrote. And I had some letters. I had quite a variety of documents about this. And then just to finish, I won't go on and on, but the really astonishing thing she did, she decided these children they should go to Tabriz, where they could be then sent into Urmia. They had to find, they couldn't just send a couple of hundred children to Urmia. They had to find homes for them, people who wanted them to come. And so they had to go to Tabriz first. And well, how to get to Tabriz? It's about, I don't know, 300 miles or 200 to 300 miles. And she had there was no staff. I mean, anyway, the end of it was they walked. And there were no men available to walk with them. So Susan walked these 250 children from Hamadan to Tabriz. And she wrote about it, so I had some information about that. But she was practical, and the other good thing about her was that she had a sense of humor. So when they were waiting for permission to leave, because they had to go through Persian territory, she had to walk these 150 children or whatever through Persian territory, of course. So she had to have permission, and then the permission was held up, and the children were ready, and everything was packed, and the children, she had taught them games to play, and she tried to get them. And in the meantime, there were two cats, just to finish this off. She had two cats she wanted to bring with her to Tabriz. And the cats also weren't very happy about waiting around for the permission to come. And so they had to keep catching the cats and putting them back in their containers. So the whole scene, while sort of, it was life-changing for hundreds of children that they could go to this place. Some of them remembered, some of them barely remembered it. But they had to walk, this long distance, and she had to do it with no men. There were a couple of older boys, but she was a woman riding across this territory, and she did it on horseback. She found if she was riding a horse, she had more authority. So it was very strategic how she did this. So that's what my book is about. It's about the journey of the children, and then how Susan then got them back to. And I will tell you one last anecdote just to finish. Bertha, our Bertha, she's the only one who went back to Persia. She once went on a kind of a trip with a group of people, and they went to Urmia, and they went to the town where they would go in the summer.
Seir? Seir.
Yeah, they went to Seir. It was one of the places they visited, and she wanted to see the grave. Some graves were there, and while she was there, so this is Bertha, a woman, an elderly woman, came and put her hand in Bertha's hand, and she looked up and she said, "You're my mother." And Bertha realized, she thought that Bertha was Susan. She was one of the children that had walked from Hamadan to Tabriz and then come back to see her. You were my mother, she said.
Mm.
So that's what this book is about. And I'm not sure this book, I'm pretty, I have a few copies and but I think it's out of print. I'm old enough that my books are going out of print. That's one thing that happens when you get old. Your books go out of print. But there are copies around if anybody wants to read it.
It is a book of healing, of course, in the sense that Susan was trying to, as you said, reverse the direction of where, his father had to go, and he passed away on that path, so that he was going. I think there is that, I mean, symbolically, at least it seems to be there.
Well, she crossed the river
Right.
where he died, where his body was laid. Later, I think they moved him to Tabriz. Is that where?
Tabriz, yes, correct. Yes.
But I think when he died, he was buried by this river. And I will tell you one thing, and you must have run into this. If you're researching, especially a village in this area, there's a pretty high percent likelihood it will have changed its name. And so you are looking under a certain name, and then it turns out that it now has a different name, or the people who make the almanacs think it has a different name. But I did find out exactly where it happened, and the path they took on this journey with the children actually crossed that river. So I was able to put it into the book. I mean, this is a novel. I just want you to know this is not a history. And so there parts of it are, I didn't write it thinking I had to be 100% accurate about everything. But I know that they crossed the very river where he was buried when he died. Yeah.
So Hooman, we have a question to go over the genealogy again. Can you share your screen on that
Sure.
last
Yes.
slide?
Sure.
And while he's doing that, please, now is a great time if you have questions for the speakers to type them in the Q&A part of Zoom. The chat is disabled, so please put them into Q&A, and we should have time to get to one or two of those. But does someone want to walk through this just briefly again?
Sure. Would you like me to do that? So the original manuscript was wrapped up by around 1912. The bulk of the manuscript, the last two chapters, are more for context building, but William Shedd never really got a chance to attend to those because he was deeply involved in relief work with the the volume of refugees that were building up at the border. And he passed away, as Celia mentioned, on the way to Hamadan. He passed away in August of 1918. Along with him was his third wife, Mary Louise Shedd. And this is one of those amazing things that we're not really sure how the manuscript made it out of Urmia. And it's possible that it was along with them with the exodus of around 80,000 Assyrian Christians that were basically fleeing the Ottoman invasion of that region. But it did survive, of course, and Mary Louise Shedd had access to it, had used parts of it, cited parts of it in her own book, the biography of William Shedd. But the original biography about John Haskell Shedd never saw the light of day until about a century later, in 2023. Ephraim did do the last two chapters. Jonathan and I, when we were looking at, I think, if I'm correct, Jonathan, we had to rearrange the chapters a little bit to make sure the flow. I think the last two chapters had to be flipped, if I'm correct, to make sure the flow of the conversation improves. But fundamentally, the text is the same. And then it's what Celia was talking about, this preservation of material, volumes of material that has been with the family since and has been finding its way to the Presbyterian Historical Society. What was also significant is the work, the photography work that Louise Wilbur Shedd had done, and it's very important not to understate her work. She was an independent person who, as a woman, had taken the task of using what was truly innovative technology, just basic, what we consider just basic photography was quite advanced, technology at that point in time. And she just snapped away, I mean, with pictures left and right. She's documented so much of just the normal life of, the daily people, that it was impossible for us not to include that, because it provides that context as to, well, what was this world all about? Yeah.
Thank you, Hooman. Kristen, I'm going to turn it over to you. I see we have some questions in the Q&A.
Sure. We have a question from Richard Taylor. He was wondering where John Haskell Shedd grew up and went to school.
Jonathan, would you like?
Yeah, well, he grew up in what was he? Well, he was born in Ohio, I think.
He was.
His family was from New England, and he was one part of this biography is tracing his ancestry, and there were many religious, many figures who were active in the church in his family, and apparently William Ambrose and John Haskell were kind of proud of that and saw themselves as part of a tradition. He did go to seminary. He was a good student, but he'd spent a lot of time just working with his father, who was an itinerant preacher who was active in getting the frontier people who had moved to Ohio from New England to be more church oriented. I mean, many of those were just frontiersmen who were out there to make a living, and the church, the activity wasn't important to them, but he thought it should be. And so he helped establish congregations in different places. And one thing John Haskell was asked to do when he was a young man, maybe a teenager, was to go to these people and begin to collect some of the money that they ought to have been given to their church that was kind of promised to John Haskell's father. So John Haskell, he was active at that level. And one thing you see is he walked a lot. I mean, there was a lot of movement in that area. But then he went to seminary. Did he go to Yale? Did he go to? No, he went to
Andover.
Andover,
Which is part of it, yeah.
Yeah, and he was partly educated in Marietta, Ohio, and then which also his son went to, as several of his sons went to. So he was part of that early push towards education of, especially of boys, but they seem to want educated women too, in that region. But he got together with people who wanted to be missionaries, and they were a group who were active in wanting to be missionaries. And as I understand it, I mean, I'm not a historian, but this was a time of very active movement in the Protestant churches in New England, and people were starting new wings of denominations, and they were debating what the doctrine of the church should be exactly. And he was active in that. But he had made this decision he should be a missionary. And so he awaited. And at one point, he was really hoping to go to Japan. He thought being among the very first to get to Japan would be very interesting. But instead, he ended up, and he got quite interested in Persian. I think who was the missionary who was back in the United States giving talks and kind of promoting the mission to the Nestorians, and he heard that man and was that
Perkins, I believe, yes.
Perkins would, and he got interested in that. I mean,
Hey,
to me,
Jonathan,
it's just quite astonishing as a 21-year-old to make that big a decision and carry it out and make it your life's work. If I might I don't know, this is answering a different question, but the impact on me, you can see that my sister Celia engaged with this family history as a writer and as a person interested in what they did and how it reflected on how you can write about people in different kind of extreme situations. My way of engaging with it was to turn the other way. I didn't want to locate myself so much in this family history as in just the world of people. And I think it was partly because William Ambrose Shedd became a kind of martyr in some, if you read the stories about the Yankee Cadi and so on, he was seen as, you know, a missionary you could write about. You could write a story about him that would motivate other people. And I don't know, I might have picked this up partly from my mother, I guess, who in some ways I think felt abandoned by her father, who brought her to the United States, then went away, as Celia's explained. Susan understood it, but my mother was 9 years old, and it was more like, wait a minute, what's happening to me? I'm being left with these relatives I hardly know. So she told stories, but in a way she emphasized the overall situation rather than how she felt about her father. So I kind of, I think I must have been influenced because I too went away and tried to learn about other cultures and write about it. I became very interested in Africa, and for my academic career, and wrote quite a bit about Africa. But I was old enough to come to terms with my family. And it's been a really interesting journey for me to get to know this family and to see, oh, I am connected with it. And also to see it as part of this tremendous change that it covered the whole world with World War I. And the buildup between the Civil War and the end of the Ottoman Empire, the kind of conflicts that were beginning under John Haskell Shedd's presence in that region, and then later they came to a head with the World War I. And we talk about war, but this was destruction of peoples. We have to just see that this was the Armenian genocide was going on. There was an intentional driving out of Christians by some of the groups, and the Christians weren't always they were not pacifists. They weren't always, they had a certain strength, and the missionaries had given them that strength. So it becomes part of the mission story to understand the dynamics of what happened in that region. And so that's been part of my interest, both to learn about my family and think about how different parts of the family have received dealt with their relationship to this, but also to understand how it fits into the wider history of the world. And it's an amazingly interesting region just because it had so many religions. There were Jewish villages, there were Babist, the forebears of the Baha'i faith, active in the region. And the Armenians were divided into different churches. The Nestorians were divided into different groups. There was a patriarchy. And the Americans there were trying not only to give them Christianity, but to give them the idea that they should democratically control their own congregations in the Presbyterian manner that set up a kind of hierarchy, but each church was supposed to fund itself eventually. And this was something new to them, but the missionaries thought it was religion. I think it was a kind of Americanism being broadcast there. that had an effect on them. So so the dynamics are really interesting. So that's where it has meant very much to me to get involved in this, but it took me to get over a hump to get there. And I thank the others, especially Hooman, for making me push that way.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. We have a question from Fred David. He was wondering if there is information, if you have any information about Reverend Jacob David and his family. He was the headmaster at Urmia School.
I don't believe there is anything in this manuscript mentioned, but that's something that maybe if he would like to reach out to me, we can see if we can help identify or locate the relevant information. So just email me, please.
And then a question from Susanna Hennigan. We've learned to question narratives which position Westerners in a position of savior to communities of color. I'm a descendant of John Haskell Shedd. How do you panelists suggest I understand his impact and the impact of the mission in the context of the community where the mission was located and served?
Well, if I can say a little bit about the feel I have of it. The main people that the mission served was in the city of Urmia, and it came to have, especially after there was some conflict in the region, many Nestorians, Assyrians moved to Urmia, to the city of Urmia. And so part of the mission's activity just had to do with dealing with these people and representing their relationship to the other groups there. And I mean, what's outstanding for me comes after John Haskell Shedd, it's under Will Shedd, was he seemed to be taken as the representative of this group in its dealings with other groups. And okay, so you have to have this picture of a place that if the Russian, I mean, we haven't mentioned the Russians were very active in this area before World War I. And so in this period, for a time, they were the dominant power in the region. Unfortunately, or anyway, in reality, the Persian government itself was pretty weak in this area. And so the Ottomans and the Russians were powerful. And then there were other kind of strongmen who represented different groups, some of them Kurdish, some of them people from the local Muslim population. And there was a lot of negotiation, a lot of what would you do if there was a conflict between people from different groups about money or about women or about property? Well, Will Shedd was very much involved in that. So he became a kind of emissary. So this is beyond, I mean, the mission was kind of an established part of the community, and he was working on that basis. And so he had that role, and I think he was known as quite a good peacemaker, quite a good at de-escalating conflict and finding solutions and talking to the influential people in different groups. One reason he could do that is he knew several languages of the area, and he'd lived there long enough that they had respect for him. And I think he had a way of carrying himself that invited respect and leading a way of life that invited respect. So that's one thing I see in him that I admire a great deal. When you think of, he was a young man doing this. He died as a relatively young man. And he took this so seriously. The other thing about him is he wrote. He wrote lectures. He wrote essays. Some of them are published in a book called it's called what is it called?
Islam and the Oriental Church.
Islam and the Oriental churches. I mean, and so he's trying to come to terms with the learning and understanding that the more learned people in the different religions had of their own faith. And he had a lot of respect for all these faiths. He makes it clear that Christianity is superior to them in his own thinking, but he had a lot of respect for them. And in his writing, he makes that clear. And one thing that astonishes me about, it's true of John Haskell Shedd too, is that how they found it exciting and possible to have these basic discussions about human values with people in villages and kind of remote places, and finding people who wanted to talk about that. You know, how do you lead a good life? What kind of belief is best for you? Why do you think Jesus is your savior, or Muhammad is the source of your truth? And they were willing to talk about those things and enjoyed talking about them. And just to add one note that this work doesn't finish easily, there is another manuscript written by William Ambrose Shedd that hasn't been published. And I don't know if anyone listening here knows about it. Maybe they know more than I do, but it's a shorter book, but it's about the experience of the mission in the year 1915, which was one of a real crisis. And I think Will wanted to make people understand it. And I think he wrote it knowing he was going to come back to the United States and tour the country and give talks, partly to raise money to support what became this Near East Foundation. But it's a pretty well completed manuscript, less completed than the one we just have been talking about. But I think I'm kind of worried that Hooman is going to give us a big push on this. But
That'll be the next project.
And I want to say one more
Jonathan.
before. Just let me say one more thing about the John Haskell biography. The chapters that Will wrote cover his whole life. The chapter he didn't get to write was about the final trip his father made to Hamadan, to a very big, important meeting of missionaries. And it would have drawn together themes in the book, but I think it's really important to know before you start reading, thinking you're going to read it without an ending. It does have an ending. And what his brother added was his own reminiscences about the family. It's quite different from the rest of the book. It's not the same story, but it gives a context of a life, of a family life to the book, which is actually puts an interesting light on it. And the final chapter is the other chapters, the memories people have written about John Haskell Shedd after he died, or as he was dying, the letters, how they're appreciating him and understanding him. So it makes you see the spread of his influence and the kind of feelings other people, his associates, have for him. So it adds to the book too. But his life is well covered by the chapters that his son wrote.
So before we start losing people, I'm afraid people will have to sign off before we put the slide up. And I wanted to let everyone know that Celia, Jonathan, and Hooman have very graciously said that they would welcome people to reach out to them. So Kristen is going to share her screen, and well, she put some things in chat, and then I think you're going to put the slide up as well. That also has the link if you want to purchase the book. So and Celia, we will keep the slide up for a bit. I know I'm very sorry to cut you off. Do you want to keep
Okay.
talking as this is up here?
It's all right.
Well, again, thank you so much, all of you. This has just been a really fascinating first glimpse into this important history, and also the real importance of archival sources, both to writing and publishing histories, but also to really understanding and getting into family history. And, you know, when those two things come together in the way that they have with the Shedd family papers writ large, I think everyone is just so blessed for that. And the Presbyterian Historical Society is really honored to be able to hold the materials that we do. And I'm excited to know there's some more materials out there. Please, Jonathan, Celia, do you want to just say anything about the kinds of contacts that you're hoping to come out of this? Because I think you think that there may also be some Shedd relatives on this Zoom, and who you're hoping you could make some connections with.
Yes, well, I do. I hope that. Please get in touch. Also, I think if you happen to have other papers when you're ready to get them out of your direct control, give them to the Presbyterian Historical Society. That it's a wonderful place to work, and they do make them available. Their archivists actually know more how to arrange things than other people do. So, and they will add to what's there. I think this is a very rich archive, and I can see other writing come out of it. The story is, when we first gave those boxes, Nancy Taylor said to us, well, you know, maybe somebody will find them interesting. It's, you know, we get some researchers coming in here. And I thought, yeah, I bet. Then Hooman turned up, and the rest is history.
Well, thank you so much. Jillian, am I saying your name right? Jillian Gillian? Jillian, you never got introduced, and I feel bad about that.
I'm not the last generation of descendants in the Barker line from these Shedds, but I'm one of the more recent generations. I'm Jonathan's daughter. For anybody who's still going to hang on for a minute, I actually would like to reinforce the question that somebody asked of Hooman, to just tell us how you got interested in this. Like, how did you come in? For me, that would bring this round to
Okay. Well, thank you for asking that, Jillian. My field actually is not history or theology or anything like that. I'm a professor of business, and many years ago, I got fascinated by the writing a book by a person by the name of Morgan Schuster, a banker, sort of in a similar field as I am today, who in 1911 had gone to Iran to serve as the country's treasurer, which is fascinating. So an American trusted so much that he would serve as Persia's treasurer. And through him, I found out about the missionaries and followed up on that. And of course, I was very lucky because the Presbyterian Historical Society has very accessible material. And the Measure of a Man, which is the biography of William Shedd, was sort of very transformational. And then, of course, a lot of archival material related to that period from the Presbyterian Historical Society. And, you know, once you get into this, like it's just a one-way path. You just have to keep on going. And so, yeah, but thank you for asking that.
It's a good question.
I see
Thank
that.
you.
I see that there was a correction to Celia's email address posted in the chat. For anyone who is writing down those addresses, make sure you catch that correction.
I think the problem is I have two email addresses and probably,
Well, they both work.
I think that would be true.
Okay.
So is the number 35 or 36?
It's 35.
Oh,
That part of it is, that would be a mistake, yeah. The other one is celia.lotridge0104@gmail.com. 0104 being my birth date. 01.
okay. So I think we had the 35 on the slide, didn't we,
Yeah.
Kristen?
And that's
Yeah.
okay.
Okay, okay.
It's for my personal one, but I mean, this is all very personal. This whole subject.
Yeah,
And so it's fine. It works. It works. Not as crowded as
A minor correction, my name's not John, John. If you want to call me John, you have to spell it Jon, but my full name is Jonathan, yeah. I used to say, no, don't call me John, but unless you spell it Jon, then you can.
well, please, yeah, please don't let that stop you. I know they would be very glad to hear from you also, and Hooman as well. So if you need information you missed, you're welcome to reach out to us at PHS and we can pass along contact information. And I think we may send out this contact information also to the folks who registered with their email. So we'll make sure that it gets out to you, and the recording should be up in about a week or so, potentially. And so that's also a way to share it with people that were not able to join live. So thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure to work with all of you on Zoom, and Hooman has been here in person, and that's just been lovely. So thank you, and thank you very much, everyone, for supporting PHS Live. It's a way for us to come together on Zoom and share a lot of this really interesting history. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
very much.
Thank you.